Senior Lieutenant Andrei Malyshev arrived at the abandoned forestry station 4 hours before dawn. The truck dropped off the reconnaissance team at a fork in the road where it became a barely discernible track and drove off without a turnaround. Malyshev surveyed the area through field binoculars. 3 huts, a well, a fire pit, all were intact, but the windows were broken from the inside, and the gate was padlocked with no sign of forced entry. The team consisted of 7 men, 2 experienced trackers from the border troops, 3 riflemen from the local garrison, and a radio operator with a cipher unit. The mission was stated as clearing out a partisan cache, but in the operational files lay a yellowed map with notes in German and a list of 13 villages deleted from the 1937 census. Malyshev assigned posts and ordered the radio operator to establish contact with the base, but the antenna failed to pick up a signal, despite the clear weather and the equipment being checked before departure. The first tracker, Grigory Savelyev, a former hunter, walked the perimeter and returned with a report. There were no animal trails around the station, the droppings were old, and the trees were undamaged by claws or antlers. Malyshev recorded this in his log, noting this was unusual for August, when bears are active before hibernation. He ordered a fire lit in the hearth between the huts to indicate their presence, but the wood burned without crackling. The flames were steady and quiet, and the smoke rose straight up in the dead calm. The second tracker, Leonid Kryukov, a young Siberian with hunting experience, suggested they inspect the immediate perimeter before dawn. Malyshev agreed, assigning 2 riflemen to accompany them, and the group headed south through an old clearing. 20 minutes later, the radio operator reported that the compass had begun to deviate. The needle was shaking and shifting 10 degrees to the left of due north. Malyshev checked his own compass and discovered the same anomaly, but noted in his log that he suspected magnetite deposits. He ordered marker tape hung on trees around the camp perimeter to ensure Kryukov's group's return was on target. The shooters secured the tapes at a height of 2 meters, using the entire skein. An hour later, as dawn began to break, Malyshev discovered that all the tapes were hanging at a height of 4 meters, although the trees hadn't changed, and the knots remained tied in the same way. Kryukov's group returned in complete silence. The men didn't call to each other, didn't crunch branches, and didn't breathe heavily after their climb. Kryukov reported that the southern section was clear, but there were no signs of human activity at all, not even old notches or fire pits. Malyshev noticed that all 3 men's hands were covered in small scratches, as if they had been trudging through brush, even though the clearing was open. He asked about the origin of the wounds, and Kryukov replied that he couldn't remember when the cuts appeared. Malyshev ordered the wounds treated with iodine and breakfast prepared, but the water in the pot boiled in 3 minutes, despite the damp wood and low heat. After breakfast, Malyshev gave the order to begin combing the forest within a 5-kilometer radius of the station. He divided the group into 2 sections. Savelyev led 3 men west toward the river marked on the German map, while Malyshev, Kryukov, and the radio operator moved north, where the buildings were marked. Before leaving, the radio operator tried to tune the receiver and picked up a fragment of a transmission in German, a short phrase announcing the end of surveillance, followed by silence. Malyshev ordered the frequency fixed, but the radio operator didn't have time to record the parameters. The receiver stopped responding to tuning, frozen on a single wavelength. The northern route led through a dense spruce forest, where the trees grew so densely that they had to move in single file. Malyshev noticed that the compass continued to drift, with the deviation increasing the deeper they went. He ordered notches to be made every 50 steps to ensure a return journey, and Kryukov complied, but after 2 kilometers, Malyshev discovered that the notches had disappeared. The bark on the trees was intact, without axe marks. He backtracked 10 steps and saw a fresh notch, but when he reached it again a minute later, the axe had left a mark on another tree, 3 meters away. The radio operator began complaining of a headache and asked to stop. Malyshev gave him an aspirin from the first aid kit and ordered him to continue, but after half an hour, the radio operator had fallen 20 meters behind, not responding to his calls. Malyshev returned and found him standing motionless, eyes open, looking up at the spruce treetops. The radio operator answered questions slowly, hesitantly, claiming to hear bells. Malyshev heard nothing but silence. He ordered Kryukov to support the radio operator, and the group turned back toward camp. The return journey took 4 hours instead of 2. The notches were no help, each one led to a fork in the road that hadn't been there on the way forward. Malyshev tried to navigate by the moss on the tree trunks, but the moss grew evenly on all sides. The compass spun freely, giving no direction. Kryukov suggested following the sun, but only diffused light penetrated through the treetops, making it impossible to see. It was necessary to determine the position of the sun. Malyshev decided to move in a straight line, ignoring obstacles, and the group began to push through windfalls and thickets, losing equipment and tearing clothes. The camp was discovered suddenly. They approached it from the east, although they had been heading north. Savelyev's group did not return. Malyshev ordered a signal fire lit and fired into the air every 15 minutes, but the shot sounded muffled, echoless, as if the sound died away a few meters from the trunk. The radio operator lost consciousness, and Malyshev laid him down in a hut, discovering that his body temperature had dropped to 35 degrees Celsius. Kryukov found a notebook in German in one of the huts with dates from 1939 and schematic drawings of trees, among which was a repeated symbol of a crown above the trunk. Savelyev's group did not return by nightfall. Malyshev left Kryukov with the radio operator in the camp and went out to search with a signal flare gun and extra ammunition. He moved westward using the compass, which now indicated direction only when moving. Whenever he stopped, the needle began to spin. A kilometer later, he discovered the first body, one of the shooters lying face down, uninjured, weapon in hand. Malyshev checked the pulse and examined the body. Death had occurred recently, the eyes open, pupils dilated, and the expression on his face was not one of fear, but of complete submission. He found the second shooter 200 meters away, sitting by a tree in the same pose of impassive expectation. Death had occurred in the same way, without a struggle, without any attempt to save himself, as if the man had simply ceased to exist on command. Malyshev fired a flare, illuminating the area around him, and in the red light, he saw Savelyev, the tracker standing 50 meters away, his back to Malyshev, absolutely motionless. Malyshev called out to him, but there was no answer. He approached, aiming his pistol, and saw Savelyev standing there with his eyes open, unblinking, not breathing, but still alive. His pulse was weak and slow. Malyshev tried to move Savelyev, but his body felt incredibly heavy, as if rooted to the ground. He shook the tracker by the shoulders and slapped his cheeks, but there was no reaction. Then Malyshev noticed that Savelyev's feet were buried ankle-deep in the earth, even though the surrounding soil hadn't been dug. He tried to dig, but his toes encountered something dense and fibrous, like roots, instead of soil. Savelyev began to sink slowly, a centimeter per minute, and Malyshev realized the process was irreversible. He tried to pull the tracker out by force, tying a rope under his arms and bracing his feet against the tree trunk, but the rope snapped, and Savelyev sank knee-deep. Malyshev returned to camp at dawn, finding his way back instantly. The forest seemed to push him toward the station. Kryukov met him with the report. The radio operator had died in his sleep, without agony, with the same resignation on his face. Malyshev examined the body and discovered that the skin was covered with fine green veins, reminiscent of the wood grain. He ordered Kryukov to gather equipment for an immediate retreat, but the tracker refused, declaring that an exit was impossible. The forest would not let go. Malyshev drew his pistol and ordered him to carry out his orders, but Kryukov calmly pointed to the trees around the camp. They had closed in tighter, forming a solid wall, and the clearing through which the truck had arrived had disappeared. Malyshev checked the perimeter himself and confirmed that Kryukov was right. There was no escape. He returned to the hut and found the German notebook Kryukov had discovered the day before. The last entry read in broken Russian, "The territory has an owner. Leaving is permitted only with permission. Permission is granted through voluntary sacrifice." We didn't know. Now we know. Beneath the entry was a crown symbol, drawn with a trembling hand. Malyshev spread the map out on the table in the hut and attempted to determine the camp's position relative to the villages marked on it. He discovered that all 13 settlements were arranged in concentric circles around a single point, not marked on the map but corresponding to their current locations. The German documents mentioned a 1939 study conducted by an ethnographic group studying local cults. The final report described the legend of the Forest King, not a beast, not a spirit, but a territorial intelligence governing the forest as an extension of its own body. Kryukov found a metal box in the hut's basement containing the remains of the Soviet expedition of 1937. Inside were the personal documents of the expedition leader, a map with the same concentric circles, and a handwritten report. The report described a series of disappearances of village residents that began after an attempt at industrial logging in 1929. The disappearances occurred not simultaneously, but sequentially, first the loggers, then their families, then entire villages. The final entry read, "The forest does not forgive intrusion. It demands recognition of sovereignty. We tried to negotiate. There are only 3 of us left." Malyshev realized that the 1937 expedition was not a purge, but an attempt to establish contact. The failure led to the erasure of the trees. A day from the census and classification of the area. The Germans tried again in 1939 and disappeared in the same way. Now the NKVD sent another group, not for the purpose of study, but to test how effectively the territory was isolating itself. Malyshev was not the commander of the purge, but a test subject in an experiment to verify the phenomenon. Kryukov began to laugh quietly, without joy, and said he understood the rules. The forest doesn't kill, it accepts. Resistance is pointless, because there is no one to resist. The forest is not an enemy, it simply is, and its presence is absolute. Kryukov left the hut and headed toward the fire pit. Malyshev followed him and saw the tracker stop in the center of the camp, raise his head to the treetops, and freeze. A minute later, Kryukov began to sink into the earth just like Savelyev, slowly, without a struggle, with an expression of relief on his face. Melishev rushed toward him, grabbed him by the jacket, but Kryukov pushed him away, saying, "Don't interfere. This is the only way to end it right." Melishev retreated and watched as the tracker sank waist-deep, chest-deep, neck-deep. The last thing to disappear was the crown of his head, and the earth closed in without a trace of excavation. Melishev was alone. He returned to the hut, grabbed his pistol, and walked to the edge of the forest, intending to break through by force. He fired at trees, chopped at trunks with an axe, shouting, demanding an exit. The forest didn't react. The trees stood unharmed, the bullets vanished into the bark without a trace, the axe slid without leaving a mark. Melishev realized that violence was pointless. He lowered his weapon, sat down on the ground, and for the first time clearly heard, not a sound, but a presence. It didn't speak, but it conveyed a meaning directly, acknowledged the border. Melishev stood up, turned his back to the forest, and walked toward the center of the camp. There he sat down by the dying fire, placed his weapon beside him, and froze. He didn't resist, didn't accept, simply waited. The forest left him untouched. An hour later, Melishev stood up and discovered the trees had retreated, a clearing had opened. He walked along it to the road without looking back. The forest had let him go because he hadn't won or surrendered. He simply ceased to be a threat. Melishev reached the road after 3 days of marching. A truck was waiting for him at a fork in the road with another crew, a driver and an NKVD officer accompanying him. The officer took his report silently, without asking a single question about the group's fate. Melishev was taken to the regional center, where he underwent a medical examination. Doctors recorded exhaustion, dehydration, and multiple abrasions, but described his mental state as stable. A week later, he was summoned to the special department. The interrogation was conducted by a colonel, who didn't introduce himself. He listened to Melishev's entire report, without interrupting, jotting down key points. The colonel then pulled out a folder marked Top Secret and showed a map. It showed 17 zones across the Soviet Union with identical characteristics: population disappearance, equipment failure, and the impossibility of mapping. Melishev recognized the concentric circles and the crown symbol. The colonel said Melishev's expedition was the 32nd in 10 years. All previous expeditions had failed to return, with the exception of a few survivors who were placed under observation. The colonel explained that the zones had been declared closed territories without official justification. Military personnel were not allowed in, geologists were not conducting research, and no resettlement was planned. The existence of the phenomenon was classified at the Politburo level. The task of these structures was to maintain isolation and record border changes. Melishev asked why they continued sending groups if the outcome was known. The colonel replied that stability needed to be monitored, whether the behavior of the zones was changing, whether the borders were expanding, whether new rules were being introduced. Casualties were inevitable, but manageable. Melishev was transferred to the archives department, barred from travel and contact with active operatives. He was given a separate apartment, his rations were increased, and he was scheduled for monthly medical examinations. Officially, he was listed as a second-degree disabled person due to mental illness, although he showed no symptoms. Every month, he was summoned to a psychiatrist, who asked the same questions. Did he have nightmares? Did he hear voices? Did he want to return? Melishev answered negatively to everything except the last question. He did want to return, but not to the forest, the time before the expedition, when he could have refused the mission. A year later, Malyshev received a letter without a return address. Inside was a clipping from an internal NKVD report. Another group of 9 people had been sent to the Siberian zone, their mission being to set up an observation post. Malyshev learned the coordinates, the same forestry station. He wrote a memo demanding that the expeditions be stopped, enclosing his own report. There was no response. 2 months later, another cutting arrived. The group hadn't returned, the zone had expanded 5 kilometers to the south, and 2 more villages were isolated. Malyshev realized that the system wouldn't stop. The zones were being studied by sacrifice, and each new expedition wasn't an attempt to solve the problem, but a way to maintain it in a stable state. The forest wouldn't expand aggressively until it received confirmation. Maintaining boundaries through the disappearance of trespassers. The structure feeds the zones with people to keep them contained. Malyshev is the only one who escaped without becoming a victim or breaking the rules. This has made him a witness, unable to be eliminated, but also unable to be released. He lives in isolation, marking new zones on his personal map using scraps of information that leak through archival documents. By 1945, there were 23 of them. Malyshev knows that one day the borders will close, or the structure will stop feeding the zones, or an error will occur, and one of the territories will decide that the silence has been broken. He is the only one who understands the rules, and the only one no one listens to. Every night, he wakes to silence, the same absolute silence that reigned in the forest. The silence is not outside. It is within, and he knows that the forest has not released him completely. He simply waits for Malyshev to violate the only condition of survival, telling the truth to anyone who would try to exploit it.